What makes you happy?
Be yourself, be positive. Just another mindset.
Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Just Another Mindset podcast. We need a paradigm shift if it comes to our economic and social systems. Let us drive this change together. The Just Another Mindset podcast shares inspiration and tangible techniques on how to create seismic shifts in an outdated system, collectively and for individuals alike. My name is Ismail, and each week I bring to you a relevant conversation, message, or theme that will not only entertain you, but help you to change towards a more meaningful and satisfying life. Get encouraged by listening to successful thought leaders, inspiring individuals, and impressive changemakers. Change from within will last and create positive results for all of us. Let us get inspired and embrace collective changes for the better. In today's episode, I share with you a conversation that I had with Andrew Eil. Andrew is a consultant specializing in climate change policy and capital markets, climate risk and resilience, impact investing and ESG considerations, and development finance. He is currently head of climate risk for North America with Tata Consulting Services. With nearly 20 years of international experience in public policy, diplomacy, sustainable finance, and international development, Andrew brings versatility and interdisciplinary expertise to a broad portfolio spanning client advisory, strategic planning, resource mobilization, thought leadership, and multilingual fieldwork. In this episode, we talk about the constant of change. We discuss collective responsibility, and you will learn about the need to question the economic growth paradigm. We talk about Andrew's career choices and his motivation to be of service. You will hear what role self-reflection and knowing one's values play for us, and we elaborate on how we take decisions. We discuss climate policy and risk, and you will hear about climate disasters that are coming if we do not act accordingly. We discuss the sense of urgency amongst our leaders, and you will learn about the necessity of collective actions. Many systems, such as politics, economics, education, technology, need to be changed simultaneously, and you will hear about concrete first steps towards societal transformation. Wonderful, Andrew. And with that, a warm welcome to the Just Another Mindset podcast. And my first question for you today is, how do you feel and what is on your mind?
Thank you so much for having me, Ismail. I'm feeling lively, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's Monday, but it's off to a busy start. So I guess I'm feeling a little static electricity from my fingertips, in mostly a good way.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that, Andrew. And in order to give a little bit of a context, I hope that you don't mind my somewhat open-ended and somewhat provocative, but not really meant that way, question. And you have a very impressive vita, Andrew. You studied in Princeton for your master's, you have your bachelor's from Harvard, you are highly educated in finance, and you live in New York. So a question that came to mind somewhat naturally is like, how come you're not an investment banker working on Wall Street?
Why am I not an investment banker working on Wall Street? Well, I didn't always live in New York. Let's put it that way. And I didn't always work on finance. I started my career in a very different space. I was a history and literature major in college, focused on 19th century Russia. And so the initial stages of my career really emerged from that, which is very, very far removed from investment banking. So I had neither the desire nor the means to make myself an investment banker at that point in time. And my career has mostly been international and in the policy space, and only in recent years has arced towards finance. So I guess I can tell you why I was never one in the past. In terms of why I'm not one now, I suppose that's a better question to delve into. But I am learning about the space in my work as a consultant, working for many banks, and so I think I'll be in a better position maybe in a year or two to say, is that the kind of thing that I would want to do myself? But I've really enjoyed being a consultant because you get to focus on particular problems for many different kinds of clients, and without necessarily, making yourself the client, right? So I haven't branded myself a banker yet, though who knows, maybe one day that will come.
And you may or may not want to give us a little bit of background. And you talked about policy a little bit. And I suppose today you also talk quite a bit about the environment and about societal transformation. And I would be very interested, Andrew, is that something that came natural for you from the very beginning of your career or even from your education? Or since when are those topics dear or important topics for yourself?
I've always cared a lot about the environment. So that wasn't something that immediately featured prominently in my career when I started with my focus on Russian history and literature. But it was something that, going back to my childhood, I've always cared a lot about. I participated in nature camps. I was very excited when my home city of Providence, Rhode Island, began a recycling program in the early 90s, when I was still in school. And so these are issues that I've been attuned to for a long time. And I began to approach them professionally while I was living abroad in the mid 2000s, in the former Soviet Union, actually in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan at the time. And I can come back to that if you'd like, but I was concerned with questions of local economic and social development, and it became increasingly apparent to me that those were inseparable from questions of environmental sustainability, because where I was living uh, in Almaty, Kazakhstan, which is the commercial capital and largest city, at that time, the country was experiencing an economic boom, and the number of cars on the road doubled in the span of the 4 years that I was living there. And so it became very congested. The air pollution became worse. And it was an object lesson, really a lived experience, that one can't continue this pell-mell growth indefinitely, that one reaches these limits of what one can do, what human society can do, without regard towards environmental sustainability, both from the perspective of human society itself, but of course also for the planet and for its ecosystems. And so I, at the same time, became aware of climate change as an issue, and was quite keen on dedicating myself to work in that space because of the existential challenges that it poses. And that wasn't quite as clear then as it is now, but frankly, for anyone who was paying attention and reading the IPCC reports, this issue has been coming for a very long time. So that was almost 20 years ago at this point that I first kind of had this awareness of climate change as something big and important, and uh, indelibly marking human society and its future. So that was what brought me into the space, and I've had gradual iterations of getting deeper and deeper into it, and then focusing my interest within that space as it has grown. At that time, it was a fairly small and niche area. Now you can work on climate change in any kind of organization, in any sector, doing just about anything. And so it isn't as perhaps as meaningful as it once was to say, oh, yes, I have a job related to climate change and sustainability, right? Right now, you say that, and it doesn't actually tell you all that much about what one is doing. So, there's been a lot of evolution for me personally, as the field itself has evolved as well.
No, absolutely. And yet it's very important that you actually do what you do and push forward those very interesting initiatives. And Andrew, I would be in fact very interested. I have a follow-up question or a couple of follow-up questions on Kazakhstan. It's actually a country where that's a personal note, where I really wanted to travel. I wanted to travel Central Asia, and I wanted to do so in winter of 2020. And a couple of friends suggested not to do it by myself in winter because my route looked a little bit too adventurous. That's a story for another time. But I would be very interested. You talk about Kazakhstan and you talk about an economic boom. And you also talk about climate change. My first question would be, what brought you to Kazakhstan to begin with? And the second question would be, in Kazakhstan, if you had this economic boom, did people also perceive / talk about something like the climate change, or was for them the most important fact that there is an economic boom and that they look at all the benefits and not so much at the downsides of such?
Yeah, great questions. So, how did I wind up in Kazakhstan? I was studying in Moscow after finishing my undergraduate studies in the 2002-2003 academic year. And I was on a fellowship at the time. I was taking some courses, but I had an inkling that I didn't want to go into a PhD program or pursue a career in academia. So I took up an internship with a foundation, an American-based foundation called the Eurasia Foundation, that at the time and still supports a number of different initiatives and programs promoting economic and social development in a number of different countries. At that time, it was exclusively focused on the post-Soviet space, which was why it was founded right after the Soviet Union collapsed, to essentially help those countries transition to a market economy, to self-government, where you have population and community-driven initiatives, not just top-down government, civil society, and related institutions that make society vibrant. And so I really enjoyed my time volunteering as an intern with that group while I was still studying in Moscow. The year ended, my fellowship ended, I had to find a job, figure out what to do with myself. And I had the good fortune to be offered a job by the Eurasia Foundation in their Central Asia regional office. So that was my ticket to employment and to doing something exciting in the field in a Russian-speaking environment. That was pretty much my only marketable job skill at the time. And so off I went. I hopped on a plane from Moscow, holding, a travel guide on Central Asia, trying to figure out where I was going and what the heck I might be doing there. And I thought I brought a bunch of books with me because I thought, gee, in Central Asia, what am I going to do? Maybe I'll just spend a lot of time reading, by myself. Well, that wasn't exactly how it turned out. It was an incredibly fulfilling experience professionally and socially, and that is a subject of conversation in and of itself. We should perhaps get a beer and trade Kazakhstan stories, because I want to know what happened to your winter trek. But in any event, that's how I wound up there. Was as at the time the communications coordinator for the region for the Eurasia Foundation, coming out of that experience studying in Moscow.
And talking about this economic boom in Kazakhstan and climate change, was there an awareness also within the country? Was there already a focus on such, or how did the development back then look like for yourself?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I forgot to answer that one. So, on the one hand, I wouldn't say there was awareness of climate change at the time. But what does, I think, resonate a lot with the society in Kazakhstan is environmental protection and stewardship of natural resources. Why environmental protection? It so happens that in the 1980s, and prior, I believe, there was a lot of nuclear weapons testing in Kazakhstan. And the environmental fallout from those kinds of, you know, Soviet military and scientific experiments and, industrial scale kind of conquest of the natural world, those things left a real scar on the landscape, or many scars. And there actually was very high awareness of environmental issues in Kazakhstan in ways that it did not exist in many other places, to my knowledge, around that time. So there was already a culture and something of a heritage of that sensitivity around environmental issues in that region and in Kazakhstan in particular, that I do think has made the broader Kazakhstani society more open to considering those kinds of issues. Now, that's not to say that it's an environmentalist paradise there, and there, like everywhere else, there I think are real challenges with um, raising awareness and building um, political will for environmental initiatives, and particularly where they come into conflict with economic goals. That's a very difficult challenge, no matter how you slice it, because someone's environmental protection is someone else's lost job sometimes. That can be simplistic, and of course it doesn't serve. It often serves the polluter's narrative to suggest that environmental protection comes at the cost of economic growth. But it is true that society has to balance different values and things. Any actions tend to have pros and cons and costs and benefits, and how those get weighed is challenging. And managing environmental issues is fundamentally often about longer term considerations, non-monetary considerations, concerns about equity for people in society who don't get to make a lot of economic and political decisions. And so those are not easy issues to manage anywhere. And that was certainly true in Kazakhstan as well. But I think Kazakhstan has a lot to be proud of in terms of the initiatives it's pursued. It was one of the first countries in Asia to institute a carbon price. It's had some very aggressive environmental initiatives over the years. They've pursued renewable energy. Of course, they also are one of the largest producers of coal. So it's a mixed picture. But there are not many countries that do have major coal deposits that have voluntarily given them up, let's say. So I don't think that we should necessarily hold that against them too much. But it's a mixed picture. It's a mixed picture. And the one other thing I'll say is, because of sensitivities around water and desertification, issues around the drying up of the Aral Sea, around melting of glaciers, and the ability to engage in grazing for herders. The nomadic and herding cultures are deeply embedded in the Kazakh culture and heritage. There's a lot of awareness of the natural world and its vulnerability. And so I think that has helped to lead to a heightened sense of awareness and responsibility around these issues, perhaps than your average country, whatever that might be.
And maybe we can use that to switch gears from the past to the present a little bit. And to which extent are you still connected to individuals or to business leaders or to corporations, if we talk about Kazakhstan today as one example for this very area? Where do you feel or even know where they stand on that topic?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, so my engagement with the country has sort of ebbed and flowed over the years. I moved back to the US from Kazakhstan in 2007. So I'm revealing my age a little bit. You know, it's been quite some time since I lived there, but I still have friends there. I've done projects in the Central Asia region over the years. I worked as a diplomat for a while, and I covered as part of my portfolio that region. And I'm still in touch with the Eurasia Foundation, and they have a local affiliate, the Eurasia Foundation of Central Asia, that I remain in touch with, and I hope to continue to support them and serve in some capacity. So there's some discussions underway that I might actually continue to do some work helping them, which I would be very excited to do if it materializes.
No, it sounds like wonderful. Crossing fingers for that. And Andrew, you just mentioned diplomacy, and I suppose that besides Kazakhstan, there are a few or actually quite a few, very interesting steps in your career. And I don't know if some particular milestones come to mind if I would ask you to pick and choose a couple of them and maybe elaborate and tell us a little bit what happened between 2007 and 2023 when we are recording this podcast.
What were the milestones? That's a long stretch of time. So I came back from Kazakhstan in 2007 to go to graduate school, which you mentioned. I did a public policy degree focused on international development with a big helping of public policy and economics and climate change issues all rolled in. I finished that in 2009, and at that time I moved to Washington, D.C., and I spent a year working on a number of research projects for the World Bank Group, both the International Finance Corporation, the IFC, which is the private sector investing arm, and then there's the arm of the World Bank Group itself, the World Bank itself, that invests and supports governments. And so I did some work for the two of those, and then in 2010 I applied and was for a job and was hired at the Department of State, so the United States Foreign Ministry, working in their climate change office, supporting foreign assistance programs that were using US taxpayer dollars to help developing countries to transition to low carbon energy. And the way the State Department works is a lot of their programs are tied to various types of diplomatic initiatives, whether they are bilateral initiatives, they might be groupings of countries that are trying to achieve a particular objective related to a technology or a type of pollutant or a geographic region. And also there was a lot of work that we did with UN agencies and development banks that were collective global efforts around climate, for which there were certain funds available that the US government provided in support. And so that was what most of my work was focused around. It was kind of at the intersection of international development and foreign assistance on the one hand, and then diplomacy with a focus on climate issues.
No, that's very interesting. And I have a question there. And Andrew, how would you choose or how would you decide whether or not to proceed a certain career step or path? I know that in our pre-talk we discussed that now, of course, it looks like there is this proper thread and everything makes sense, but that sometimes throughout careers it actually is not always like that. So I would be very interested. How did you take the decision to take that job or to leave this job offer behind and to go for something different? How do you take those decisions?
Well, I want to make clear that I don't have some uh, mastermind plan extending deep into the future for exactly what I'm going to do at certain moments in time. One of my least favorite questions that I ever get, around whether it's a job interview or just a cocktail party or what have you, is what's your 5-year plan? Because I don't tend to think in those terms. I tend to think, which is not to say that strategic planning or planning at all are not valuable, but in terms of one's career, I think shorter increments of time where you're really focused on developing particular skill sets and bodies of knowledge, and meeting people in pursuit of certain interests and goals is often more helpful than saying, oh, I'm going to do this in 2023 and that in 2024 and this in 2025, and it's going to work like clockwork, and I'm going to put on blinders and not pay attention to anything else because I know exactly what I want. There may be people for whom that works very well, and I think um, that can work very well. But I like to allow my interests and opportunities to sort of develop and emerge organically, and then assess them as they arise, and be positioned to pivot when new and interesting and exciting opportunities come along. And that has generally been my MO throughout my career. And in the case of the State Department position, the work I was doing at the World Bank and the IFC was short-term work, so I didn't really have a full-time position to give up. And the State Department position, I actually came in through a relatively uncommon route in that I simply applied for a civil service position off the street. Many people will apply for the Foreign Service. Coming out of graduate school, they'll apply for special fellowship programs that are feeders for career service in government. And those, I think, are much more strategic. And then there are, of course, political appointee positions that are put in place by the current presidential administration. All those tend to be much more common pathways into government for people who know what they want to do and can plan for those in advance. For a variety of reasons, I either didn't apply for those or wasn't selected for those. So that was not really an option on the table for me at the time. And I applied for a job that was posted and had no inkling whatsoever that that was something that would work out necessarily. But it did. And I evaluated it as it came along, and it was a very attractive opportunity. So that itself was not that hard of a decision for me at the time. But it was hardly a strategic one. It was one where I happened to find out about the position, and I guess was well positioned to take advantage of it. So that, I think, in a nutshell, it's been experiences like that that uh, have helped to form my worldview, right? Similarly, with my position in Kazakhstan, actually, I didn't know that they were going to offer me a job at the end of my internship. In fact, I experienced a lot of angst looking for work as my fellowship was ending, and I applied for jobs that I didn't get hired for and didn't know what I was going to do with myself. And it was really serendipity that they did offer me a position at the end of that process. And I could say, oh, I planned it that way all along, but that wouldn't really be true. So I certainly want your viewers and listeners to take that message away, that I definitely did not have it all plotted out in advance. And I think if you're true to your um, uh, to what motivates you, right, and you throw yourself into it, then people will, I think, in many cases, recognize that passion. They'll recognize your experience and knowledge, and good things can come of it, right? So you work hard, you try to chase opportunities, and you can under the right circumstances make your own luck. And it doesn't always work out, but if one accepts that one has limited agency in the world, that you can't always sort of make everything happen yourself, then what you do is you expose yourself to opportunities, and you position yourself to take advantage of those opportunities when they arise. And that's, I guess, why I don't really believe in the 5-year plan. If I thought I could do it all myself, then I could ignore everything else in the world and just do it, right? But I think there's so many things outside of one's immediate control that recognizing those external factors create opportunities means it can be better to sort of bide one's time and position oneself for the opportunities when they arise, and then you jump for them. That's been my approach.
No, I very much agree that also experimenting will somewhat create opportunity and possibility. And Andrew, I would be very, very interested. You talked about understanding, I suppose you called it drivers. And I had a question which was, and I don't know if you want to share that with us, but are there certain drivers or values that you have self-reflected on for yourself that you use as a foundation to take those decisions in whichever direction they go? So are there certain values that you can share with us today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I consider myself someone who has always been motivated by curiosity, and has also always been motivated by doing things that I believe have societal value. Let's put it that way. That's, I think, a broad way of putting it. So I don't, I've worked in many different kinds of jobs. I've worked across all different sectors, across government, across nonprofits, across for-profits. So I don't think there's any one way to do that. I very um, uh, strongly believe that there is not any one way to be in a meaningful career. But I do think that ultimately you, well, let me put it this way. I won't project onto others, but I will say that for me, I've had the good fortune to enjoy school, and therefore be able to apply myself to studies that inspire me and interest me. And I've also had the good fortune to be able to work in jobs that I feel allow me to pursue higher order things like service and values alignment, and not only have to think about the financial considerations of what do I and my family need, right? Not everyone has that luxury all the time, but by having those two North Stars, I guess, that's a bit of a contradiction in terms there's only one North Star, but I guess if you take them together, right, things that inspire me and keep me interested in and invested in the things that I'm working on, that creates its own momentum, right? I think it's very, very hard to stay passionate and committed and really do your best work if you're doing something that you're not actually deeply committed to, whether it's because it's not that interesting or it doesn't align with your values. And some people are very good at that for a variety of reasons. They say work is work, and I'm going to be disciplined, and I'm going to do it because I've told myself I'm going to do it. Whether it's because I'm someone who is inclined towards attention deficit or whether it's because I've conditioned myself from an early age that I do things that I feel have value and that interest me. I find it very hard to do that. To just say, I hate this job or I find it utterly boring, but I'm going to do it anyway for some reason or another. That is not an approach that works very well for me. I don't profess to know others, but I suspect that it is very hard to go against the grain of your own nature for very long and to excel in that kind of environment. So by pursuing values, pursuing interests, I found that to be the fuel that keeps me going. And values and interests can evolve over time. And so my career has evolved quite substantially. And I think that's a good thing. It also creates a sense of novelty, right? I think that particularly in today's world, where change seems to be accelerating, technology is accelerating. So today's job skills are, tomorrow's rubbish heap. So, one always needs to be evolving and learning. And I think that's a good thing because I think in the knowledge economy, and just we as Homo sapiens, we have uh, brains that have adaptive capacity and cognitive ability that really go to waste if you just do the same thing over and over again for 40 years, right? So I think it's actually wonderful that we can adapt and evolve and change what we do. And I find that to also be real fuel for me to pursue a job is to learn those new things and to master those new things.
To pivot and to adapt to the constant of change somewhat. Thank you very much for that elaboration. And Andrew, today or currently, you are head of climate risk for North America at one of the biggest consulting firms in the world, I suppose. And before that, from 2018 to 2021, you are a partner at Climate Finance Advisors, which is a boutique advisory firm operating at the intersection of climate change policy and financial markets. And I found it interesting because they worked on 4 practice areas. And you may choose one of the 4 that I'm going to tell to our listeners as well, or you may choose to talk about your current position. Where do those areas of interest lay for you, or what is really exciting about it? And those 4 practice areas were developing climate strategies, appraising and structuring climate smart investments, mobilizing, catalyzing, and leveraging public and private capital, and incorporating climate risk considerations into financial products, services, and operations. Of course, you can talk to all of those 4. You can choose some areas that keep you busy at this point, but maybe you can choose a couple of examples and talk about those areas of interests, where you stand now and how you got there.
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. They sound rather imposing and technical, I think, once you string them all together with all of those jargony terms. I think I'll focus on the last 2, and the jargon is mine, by the way. So or our firm. So guilty as charged. It's not yours. Let me focus on the last 2, which I think can be distilled down a bit. They are essentially climate related investing and managing risk related to climate change. And I liken those to solving climate challenges in the financial markets or with financial assets. And there's playing offense and there's playing defense. The offense is deploying financial resources, capital, money, to invest in the solutions we need to reduce emissions and manage climate impacts. So that's offense, right? It's because you are going out and you are facing the challenge, right? The defense is recognizing that whatever we do to tackle those challenges, a lot of the disruptive and adverse impacts of climate change are already here or will be here shortly. And they're baked into the system because climate change is a long-term problem that is not readily reversed. So that means that regardless of what we do, and in many cases because of what we do, there will be a tremendous amount of change and upheaval, some good, some bad, much of it disruptive. And that presents risk and it presents challenges. It also presents many opportunities. But fundamentally, if you are set in your ways and inclined to continue to do business today and tomorrow like you've always done it in the past, you are liable for some rude awakenings because many, many things in the world are changing. Not all of them, of course, are climate related, but increasingly, many of them are climate linked because climate is such an enormous, all pervasive problem that its impacts have many touch points and cascading impacts throughout society, such that if you think about these things through a climate lens, it can help you anticipate what some of these challenges are likely to be and ways in which our current social, economic, financial model may be threatened and not entirely fit for purpose in the present and in the near and not so distant future. So managing those risks and opportunities is it might be a bit more reactive. That I call that as sort of the defensive front. But that, like any good practitioner of judo, can be used. You use the energy of your adversary to your advantage, right? And so if you recognize that there is a challenge, if you position yourself to take advantage of the response to that challenge or to be in the forefront of the response to that challenge, it creates a lot of opportunities. And so in many respects, the offense and the defense are two sides of the same coin. And so I really focused on that in the last several years with climate finance advisors. Now today with TCS, I focus a bit more on the risk management side, but when really done well and done holistically, it is not strictly about risk management alone. It is about strategic opportunity and positioning and thriving in this emerging new world where hopefully we both tackle climate change, but also one doesn't need to be a victim of those changes that are coming with climate. One can be an agent of positive change and be proactive and really master those new opportunities.
Before we talk about a few examples of positive change and also maybe the importance of business leaders in driving such, I would be actually very interested in talking about this risk and managing risk, because Andrew, I somewhat reached out to you because of an article that you wrote inspired by the World Economic Forum 2023 risk report. And I want to read a quote actually from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who said we are on a highway to climate hell. And I wondered what your thoughts on this particular quote are.
Well, he doesn't mince words, does he? That is, of course, a rather bracing quotation. It's indisputable that we have already warmed about 1.1 degrees centigrade on average across the world since pre-industrial times. And we are well on our way towards committing at least 1.5 degrees centigrade warming, which is an increasingly difficult target to meet. That's the more ambitious, lower temperature rise end of the Paris Agreement target. And there are a lot of other scenarios based on our actual trajectory today that take us well beyond 2 degrees, in fact, closer to 3 degrees centigrade, which is really a staggering amount of warming that would take us far beyond any set of climatic conditions that have existed in human history. And so that's pretty frightening. And Road to Climate Hell captures that pretty well. And what he has been trying to do is issue this clarion call, really to shake people out of their torpor, to understand the gravity of the situation and the urgency of the situation, so that we will act and avert a lot of this warming and the really worst attendant adverse consequences of that warming.
Thank you very much for that comment. And Andrew, I want to read a few words from the article that you wrote, which is called World Economic Forum 2023 Risk Report. Climate disasters are coming if we don't act now, which is published by yourself in January 2023. And it reads, but most of the world is not acting as if we are on the brink of calamitous climate impacts. For one, there are hardly any countries where governments have committed to decarbonization at the rate and scale necessary even to meet the Paris Agreement targets of 2025, let alone 2030 or 2050. Many corporates and financial institutions have committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions, but some are backpedaling, many are still robustly funding fossil fuels, and few have put forward credible transition plans, leading to the creation of a high-level UN expert group to fix the problem. So my question would be, where do you see a starting point or starting points to get thoughts and data that we have since long, you mentioned it yourself, into action? Or what are also maybe actions that you already want to praise on or that you actually see happening?
So look, no one said decarbonization is easy, right? So I don't mean to criticize any one individual actor or set of actors, because this is a very difficult problem. On the one hand, there's no question that there was a lot of dilly-dallying and wasted time where we should have committed to solutions much, much earlier, both government, broader public, the private sector, and those chickens are coming home to roost now because we were not able to bend emissions curves back in, say, the 80s and 90s, when really there was already widespread understanding of the threat posed by climate change, but the lack of political will. Part of the reason for that is because the 20th and 21st century consumer economy and essentially the growth miracle that the world experienced following World War II was entirely fueled by consumption driven by fossil fuels, driven by overexploitation of natural resources, such that there isn't really an off switch. There isn't really an off switch without degrowth and without massive job loss. Short of a long, arduous, and sustained effort to develop and deploy technologies and to change behaviors that allow us to change our socioeconomic model around more environmentally sustainable practices. That's really hard to do quickly. So it is a collective action problem, and it's one that requires an unprecedented scale and scope of effort that is happening, but it is not happening at the scale and scope necessary to meet these very ambitious goals. So where is there success? I think there are lots of places to point to in terms of success. Those entities that have committed to Paris-aligned targets, science-based targets, certainly acknowledging the problem, setting a goal, is critical. That's been done by governments, national and subnational. It's been done by corporate entities and so forth. And that's really the essential first step, at least on the decarbonization side. That's only the beginning of the road, because then you actually have to do the hard work. And part of why it's so difficult for institutions to do it is because the government policies are often not in place, the technologies are not in place, the financing is not in place to really enable this transition to happen at that scale. And so everyone needs to do it, but there are a lot of headwinds that make rapid and high impact action difficult. And so those, of course, can't be put solely at the feet of those individual actors and institutions. I think that it's sometimes unfair to play gotcha with individuals, right, who may have consumption habits that are high emitting, right? Now, some of those can be really excessive and should be reined in, and there isn't always any justification for. But I think, applying Kant's categorical imperative, you could say, well, you shouldn't fly on an airplane, right? Or you shouldn't eat some, meat or cheese or what have you, which may have a carbon footprint. And I think there's sometimes a problem with applying those absolutes, because if everyone did that overnight, then you would have entire sectors of the economy that would collapse, right? And you'd have people who would lose jobs, you'd have massive disruption. And so I'm not sure that always the um, the solution is an improvement on the problem, right? And I think that part of what makes climate change so difficult is that it is so devilishly complex and difficult. So that can't be an excuse for inaction, but it does, I think, justify some circumspection over what solutions actually will solve the problem versus those that may be a bit more absolutist and ultimately a bit more performative and not as impactful. I think we need climate leadership, and I have huge respect for those who are providing that leadership and think that that's what we need. And the naming and shaming of the leaders who are not engaging in that leadership is critical. But I also think that demonizing those who participate in today's fossil fuel intensive economy and resource intensive economy tends to neglect the fact that there are often limited alternatives to that in ways that would not have unintended and adverse consequences. Just unplugging or ceasing the economic activity, I think is not necessarily the solution and not necessarily very realistic. And so we have to figure out as a society, how do we do that in a way that serves everyone's needs? And that gets into the question of adaptation and resilience in many respects, which is what I spend a lot of my time focusing on now. Of course, mitigation, the reduction of the emissions that are causing the problem, is an absolutely critical and urgent challenge and has been for a long time. But we need a just transition. We need to think about how do we protect and be inclusive of people who are adversely impacted both by climate change itself and by the societal transition out of certain sectors and into others, which creates winners and losers. It creates disruption. And, I think that sometimes you can't make an omelet without breaking some eggs, but that can't be an excuse to ignore the collateral damage, right? And so ultimately, a lot of this is about people, right? It's also about, of course, the planet itself, but it's about people. And charging ahead with certain approaches to climate without fully taking heed of what the adverse impacts are for people is potentially just replacing one set of problems with another set of problems. And so we need to do incredibly difficult things all at once, considering many, many different complex and interrelated factors. And that's why this is such a devilish challenge, but also why it's such a fascinating one, and one that I've really committed myself to for the long haul.
And also such a vast opportunity, I will call it. And I very much do agree to that. And just a few comments. I mean, you talked about this permanent growth paradigm early on in our conversation, and you talked about the growth miracle and about degrowth. And I think what's very important is to understand that, yes, we do in fact need to change our behavior and not only our technology. So it's not only about Andrew or Ismail buying electric vehicles from now on. It's about maybe also challenging the ideas that we do have about public transportation or getting from A to B to begin with. And Andrew, I have a follow-up question on that. And you work with global leaders in your current job or in your current role. And I would be very interested, to which extent do they share the feeling of urgency of Mr. Antonio Guterres or of yourself? And you may take that question wherever you want.
Well, I think there's a glass half full and a glass half empty answer to that question. I think that the focus on climate change has exponentially increased since, let's say, late 2015, when the Paris Agreement was signed. Because it was at that point that we moved beyond the paradigm of the Kyoto Protocol, that this was only a problem of the developed countries to solve. It established the 1.5 to 2 degree window as the goal that we were focused on, and that all countries needed to be part of the solution and contribute these nationally determined contributions to get there. That was really a paradigm shift. And while people pillory the Paris Agreement for not being legally binding, there was never any hope that it would be legally binding. We had a legally binding agreement with the Kyoto Protocol, and it failed miserably because even the people who signed on to it didn't uphold their agreements, and there were no consequences. There was no, penalty for non-adherence to those goals. So fundamentally, it's a collective action challenge, and we need to figure out, by hook or by crook, how do we get people to take action and to contribute to the broader solution? And that sense of inclusion and collective responsibility, I think, was in many respects, that foundation was laid with the Paris Agreement in a very powerful way. So that was an important milestone. There's also been a very substantial upswing from the private sector, as well as from subnational governments. You had the We're Still In movement in late 2016 and early 2017 come about when Donald Trump was elected president and pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement. And in some perhaps slightly perverse ways, that was a blessing in disguise, because it really laid bare the fact that national governments were not going to ride to the rescue by themselves. That was not an excuse for everyone else to sit back and let the governments fix it, which was always a pipe dream and a misconception that this wasn't going to be an all-inclusive challenge. So that, I think, really helped to turbocharge commitments by other levels of government at the state and local level, as well as by the private sector, which has stepped up in various respects in many, many different sustainability forums. And there have been groups like the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ, which was created a couple of years ago for the financial sector to commit to decarbonizing its portfolio emissions. And there's been a lot of criticism, some of it, I think, reasonable, that not all those commitments have been backed by action or have been credible. But the fact that commitments are made and then people can be held accountable for those commitments is itself a big deal. Because if you don't even have that, then it's hard to even get people's attention to do something that they haven't even promised that they need to do or will do. So I think that, as you quoted in the piece that I wrote, getting to credible action plans is really important. And we already now have a lot of commitments on the books and people who have recognized the scale and scope of the problem and the urgency of the problem. What we need now is action plans that put deeds behind words, that create and pathways and remove barriers to action, and that really create enabling environments and give entities and individuals the tools to deliver. And in many cases, there are a lot of barriers. One issue that I've worked on a lot over the years is energy subsidies, right? It is insane that in 2023, we still have hundreds of billions of dollars of explicit subsidies, actual money, that is going to support the extraction and consumption of fossil fuels. And many trillions of dollars worth of implicit subsidies, as quantified by the IMF, from not internalizing the negative externalities. In other words, basically pricing pollution. So not only, so it's a double whammy. We are actually paying for fossil fuel extraction and consumption, and we are not taxing or charging for the pollution that they cause, which is private benefit and socialized cost. So when you have those economic incentives in place, it's no wonder that it's really hard to justify economically and financially the investments and the switch to the alternatives. Now, there are other reasons why it's difficult, right? And not all cases are the resources readily available. In not all cases do we have the financing or the technology. But if you align those incentives properly, it would help a lot. It would turn those headwinds into tailwinds so that the economics would change. And that would serve a lot of positive ends that we need to address the climate challenge. So those are the kinds of things where, we can criticize someone for, driving a car, but until the government actually puts a carbon price in place that properly captures the cost of that, it's not always fair to blame the individual, right? And so, these are complicated problems that don't always have easy solutions, but there are some obvious things that we need to be doing. And changing those subsidies and lack of a carbon price is one of them, right? We also need to provide people with the financial and technological alternatives, right? To be able to change their behavior. Investing in these new technologies costs a lot of money, and it changes lives, it changes supply chains, things like that. It's hard to do these things on a dime. If we had started a lot earlier, it would have been less painful for us to implement these changes more slowly. Now we have to do them really, really fast. And it's hard to do a lot of these things really, really fast. And so I think we need to have compassion and empathy for people who mean well, but are struggling to actually execute. And we need to put ourselves in their shoes and understand, why aren't they doing this, right? Is it possible that someone who wants to do the right thing still can't really do the right thing because they lack certain inputs, whether it's knowledge or money or finance or technology or time or skills or whatever it is. If we as a society are going to conquer this problem, we need to provide all of those things, and very quickly and in large volume.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that elaboration. And Andrew, hand to heart, how much do you believe in those collective, courageous, connected acts of leadership, and what role do they really play in those transformation if we talk about society and economy and financial systems?
That's a good question. It's an open-ended question, so I'm trying to think about how to answer it. I'm not a blind advocate of leadership and advocacy, but I wouldn't describe myself as a cynic either. I think it's one of the real inputs that we need. There's so many theories of change and models of change, and we need them all, right? We need politics to change. We need culture to change. We need behavior to change. We need new technology. We need action in the marketplace. And I could bring any number of examples from any of those realms. And it's all important, but no one set of actions is going to be sufficient. They're going to not get the traction that they need if any one set is done in isolation, and it simply will be insufficient. But I think in all of those areas, you can cite a lot of examples of very meaningful progress in recent years, whether it's the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? $400 billion, give or take, for climate technology deployment in the United States. Landmark legislation. Europe is likely to follow now with a similar response. That in the realm of policy and government funding is a huge step forward. You have the regulations that have been adopted in many countries. This is something that I work on in my day job, requiring corporates and financial institutions to disclose their climate-related risks and their climate action plans and what they're doing and what they may not be doing. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, they say. And even by trying to quantify and disclose this, acknowledge that it is a material issue for investors, is something that is driving meaningful change. Because then if you're a laggard, there's nowhere to hide. You have to then put it in your report and publish it and explain to the broader public why you did or didn't do something that is in your climate risk report or your climate action report. And so that is a really important step. You have the culture shift among younger generations that have really put climate action and activism at the forefront, which I think has been huge. I myself have been involved in the fossil fuel divestment movement at a couple of universities, and people often criticize that movement as not being in pursuit of a real solution, that simply by selling your shares of an oil company back into the marketplace, are you really doing anything to create change? And I think that's the wrong way of thinking about that, right? What you're really doing is saying, we as market actors and we as investors have agency to apply a values lens to how we consume and how we invest. And that matters. That matters. It changes culture. It changes who has social license to operate. And it changes the expectations for those market actors. And so one thing that's important to mention is it's not, in most cases at least, blind divestment from fossil fuels. At least the version of it that I believe in is divestment from those fossil fuel producers, extractors, processors, and consumers who have not committed to the transition, right? It's not a crime to produce or to use fossil fuel energy today or historically where there have not been credible and economically and technologically viable alternatives. But there is no excuse for not now getting fully behind the transition, right? Now, what exactly that transition means, what it looks like, there's a lot of debate there. But I don't think it's defensible to say, we're not in favor of the transition, right? Because without the transition, we're all cooked. And so then you're part of the problem. And that there have been a lot of entities that have not committed to the transition. And so that I think is a strong rationale for something like divestment, right? So you have those kinds of movements that are very powerful. You have the investments, you have technological breakthroughs like the cost and performance of solar panels and wind turbines and batteries have expanded beyond the International Energy Agency's wildest dreams. You look at all their reports from the 2000s, and they said, oh, there'll be this gentle adoption curve. The technology won't really be adopted. Every year they were wrong, and the adoption was a classic S curve. Now, that doesn't mean that we've solved the problem, and there are a lot of nuances there, but fundamentally, we have had some incredible technological breakthroughs that have made the worst case climate projections extremely unlikely, right? We are not likely to be wedded to coal deep into the future because of the prevalence now of these new technologies. So there's a lot of progress in all of these domains, and action in all of those domains is important. And unless we do it everywhere, we're not going to achieve the scope and scale and speed that we need to tackle this challenge.
Absolutely do agree, and also acknowledging that we need this transition, which is happening more and more. But as you said, there are still big corporations, institutions, and so forth that certainly do not push forward in the scale and the pace that is needed. Andrew, I have a couple of questions that I ask each and every of my podcast guests. But before we go there, if people would like to get to know more about yourself and your work, how can they reach out and get in touch?
So my personal website is www.andrewisleconsultant.com. That's Andrew EIL consultant.com. And Andrew at andrewisleconsultant.com is my email address. So people can definitely reach out. I have the content that I do linked on that website. So that's also a good way to find me and learn about what I've been up to. Is that what you had in mind? Anything else I should add for your listeners?
No, I think that's perfectly fine. And I will, of course, make sure to link that into the podcast description. And Andrew, as I said, I have 3 final questions for today's podcast episode anyways. And the first one, which you have partially already talked to, but it is, what is it that makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is that there is a tremendous cohort of people today, particularly young people, who acknowledge that this is the defining challenge of our times in many respects, this climate challenge, and who are civic minded. I think there's a lot of civic mindedness, which I think can get lost in the Twitterverse and in a lot of the political and social tensions that we have. but I think we collectively retain tremendous will to collectively tackle challenges and to engage in collective action, engage in philanthropy, which if you look at the Greek root is about loving people, right? So I think human nature has a lot of challenges, but there's also a lot of really redeeming aspects of human nature that I think many people are committed to. And so there's a lot of um, will, and there's a lot of agency and manpower and brain power that's being committed to these challenges. And it will be bumpy, but I think we're positioned to bring our A game, better late than ever, to tackle these challenges.
Amen to that. And that leads me to the second of the three questions. And that is, Andrew, who are your mentors or whom do you look up to?
Whom do I look up to? Well, I've been very fortunate to have had a lot of really outstanding colleagues and bosses and supervisors and professors along the way who have been very generous with their time and their counsel. I think I could speak to individuals, but I think it almost that probably would be a bit of a long answer. And one thing I would like to leave sort of in the same vein of the previous answer is the um, generosity of spirit, right? That a lot of people have. And one of the reasons why I believe so strongly in um, making oneself available to provide counsel for younger people is to pay it forward, because people have been so generous to me and really helped me learn, gain experience, gain wisdom, identify and pursue opportunities. People who've opened their network to me. And so I think it's so important to do that for others, particularly those who don't necessarily come from the same wealth of opportunity. And so I think anyone who is generous in lifting up younger generations is a role model of mine.
Very much agree. Thank you very much for that word, Andrew. And the third and last question for today's episode is a rather hypothetical one, and I call it the three truths. And I would like you to imagine that you are traveling in space all by yourself, and you do that actually for quite some time, a couple of months, could even be years. And after all that solo travel, you encounter a human-like species, and they can only process three facts or three truths about humanity before they decide whether or not they want to get to know us. What is it that you tell them?
3 facts about humanity. Well, how about this? Important information. Are they friendly? Do we want to get to know them?
I suppose let's be optimistic. We want to get to know them.
Okay, let's be optimistic. I think that humanity is enterprising. I think humanity is creative. And I think humanity is conflict prone, but circumstantially capable of overcoming that conflict.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing also that, Andrew. And with that, thank you so much for being a guest on the Just Another Mindset podcast. And if there is any final message or words for the episode today, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Ismail, for having me. It's always very valuable to think a bit more deeply about one's mindset and try to crystallize some of these concepts, which I hope have been of benefit to your listeners, but I can also say have certainly been of benefit to me myself as well, because taking the time to really think through one's convictions and one's past experience is really invaluable. So thank you for inviting me and for enabling me to have this wonderful session as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ismail. A pleasure.
If you enjoy this podcast and learn from it, please feel free to share this episode with a friend or two, and make sure to subscribe to the Just Another Mindset podcast on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please use the next 10 seconds to give the Just Another Mindset podcast a rating, and know that you will help me to create more meaningful content like this, and also that it will help other people to find this content and get inspired as well. If there is any future topic or guest that you would like to hear more about on the Just Another Mindset podcast, please let me know by leaving a comment on YouTube or sending a mail directly to contact@ishmaelwondergarten.com. And if nobody told you lately, be reminded that you are worthy, you matter, and you can achieve anything.
Do more of what makes you happy.
Be yourself. Positive.
Change.
Just another mindset.